Many people don't realize just how much work, energy, and time went into preserving and reproducing God's Word throughout the millennia. In this video, we're going to be exploring just how a scribe would preserve Scripture during the medieval time period. And to demonstrate and show that, I'm going to have a real Bible manuscript that's over 700 years old that I will be showing you in this video. We're also going to explore a dramatized story of how the Bible directly affects logic and reason through the minds of people who lived during the same time period this manuscript was produced. So enjoy that story and stick it out to the end to see exactly what this item looks like and learn a lot of great history about it. The wind moves through stone towers high above the valley of Rakaseka, around the year 1225. A fortress clings to the mountain rock, its gates iron-bound and its halls cold in the morning air. Servants move across flagstones, horses stamp in the courtyard below. But inside those walls, a child is born into a family of power. His name is Thomas. Now his father is a count. His relatives serve emperors and abbots. His path seems decided before he can even walk. Influence, rank, the church's highest offices. But even as a boy, Thomas is not like the others. While weapons are polished and alliances discussed, he slips into the small chapel where candles flicker against painted saints. At only 5 years old, he is sent away. The road winds upward toward Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine monastery, rising from the hills like a city of stone. The bells there mark the hours without fail. Chants fill the cloisters. Sandaled footsteps pass over worn marble, and ink scratches across parchment in dim scriptoria. But here, among the psalms and silence, Thomas listens. He watches monks bow. He hears scriptures read aloud day after day. And somewhere in those echoing corridors, a question begins to take shape in his mind. A question he never stops asking. What is God? Years later, the stillness of the monastery gives way to the noise of the world. Thomas is then sent to Naples, where ships crowd the harbor and languages mix in the streets. Markets shout, university halls hum with argument. Here he encounters books long lost in the West, the works of Aristotle, returned through translations from the Islamic world. Pages turn, candles burn low over desks. Students debate late into the night. Aristotle speaks of nature, motion, cause, and reason. Some call these ideas dangerous, while others call them liberating. But Thomas leans closer. Then comes the decision that breaks his family's plans. Not the Benedictines, not an abbot's throne. Rather, he joins the Dominicans, barefoot preachers who own nothing, sleep little, and walk from town to town with scripture on their lips. The news strikes his family like a blow. But on the road north, his brothers intercept him. Steel glints, hooves pound, and he is seized and carried back to the family stronghold. A heavy door shuts and bolts slide into place. Months pass in a tower room overlooking the valley wind. Voices argue outside. Persuasion turns to pressure, and he is reminded of honor, duty, and future greatness. He listens, yet remains unmoved. Thomas wants truth, not rank or power. But eventually, the door opens for good. He leaves behind stone walls and inheritance and walks toward Paris. Now Paris is a world of sound. Carts rattle over bridges, vendors shout, cathedral bells roll across the rooftops. Students crowd narrow streets, their voices rising in Latin disputation. This is the center of learning in all of Christendom. Here, Thomas studies under Albert the Great, one of the greatest minds of the age. The lecture halls are thick with bodies, wool cloaks brushing and benches creaking. Quills scratch and arguments spark and flare. Thomas sits near the wall, broad and silent. The students whisper and smirk regarding him, saying, "The dumb ox." But when he speaks, the room stills. Albert poses a problem. How can human reason know anything about God? Voices rise, answers clash. Then Thomas stands. His garments rustle, and his voice low and steady. He doesn't shout, rather he distinguishes. Responding, saying yes, knowledge begins in the senses, but the mind can reason from effects to causes, from motion to a mover, from things that begin to something that does not begin, from the order of the world to a source of order. Aristotle is not the master of theology. He is rather a servant. Truth does not fight truth. The silence in the room can be cut with a knife. Albert looks at the students and says, "We call him the dumb ox, but his voice will resound through the world." And of course, it does. Years roll on like turning pages. Thomas teaches in Paris, Cologne, Rome, and Naples. Doors open into lecture rooms. Candles are lit before dawn, and he writes endlessly, not for applause, but for clarity. Questions, objections, replies, page after page, building a structure of thought as carefully as masons rising a cathedral. Popes ask for his help, kings seek his counsel. And yet, through it all, he remains a friar. Then, near the end of his life, something changes. While celebrating Mass at the altar, surrounded by the hush of the chapel, Thomas has an experience he never fully describes. When he returns to his desk, the quill rests untouched. He stops writing altogether. Pressed to explain, he quietly says, "All that I have written seems like straw." Not false, but small, beside the reality of God himself. In the year of our Lord 1274, traveling toward a church council, he falls ill. The road is rough beneath the cart wheels. He is carried into a monastery, stone walls yet again, monks praying and candles burning low. But no triumph, no great ceremony, just prayer and breath fading into silence. The dumb ox dies far from the lecture halls, but the sound of his voice, calm, ordered, unafraid of reason, faithful to revelation, continues long after the bells of his old age fall to quiet. And of course, Thomas Aquinas is one of the leading minds behind logic and reason within Christianity. He's a very important figure. Of course, I'd encourage you to read up on him as he's a fascinating person. But I want to talk a little bit more about Bible production during the 13th century, so the time that Thomas Aquinas was alive, in this video. And the manuscript I'll be using to show that is this beautiful and amazing manuscript right here. I actually just sold this one through my website. I'd encourage you to check out the website, thedivinelibrarystore.com. It's my personal website where I sell items like this all the time, and so I'm excited to ship this off to the new owner. I'll be shipping it out tomorrow as of the recording of this video, but it's really a beautiful piece of history. Now, I did do a video on this manuscript for an unboxing video, and I mentioned that I would talk about what passages on this. Now, this comes from the book of 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 2. So this initial is opening up the book of 1 Kings, which in the Latin Bible would actually be 3 Kings, because they'd have 1 and 2 Samuel were considered 1 and 2 Kings, and then you'd have 3 Kings would be the book what we refer to as 1 Kings in our modern English Bible. So really fascinating and beautiful Bible, but this is the one that we'll be referencing or talking about for this video. Now, I will mention this video is a little bit more technical in what I'll be doing, because I'm going to be talking more specifically on how a scribe would produce this manuscript essentially from start to finish. So we're going to get right into it, dive into this amazing history of how these manuscripts were produced. Of course, there's a lot of history I could go into regarding this specific one, but I have plenty of Parisian Bibles, which is what this is, a Bible from Paris, that I can talk about in future videos. So I'm going to talk about different elements of these Bibles over time, and I've already talked about it in a lot of my previous videos, which of course I'd encourage you to check out. But what we start with for these Bible productions is, of course, the material. How was this material acquired and where did it come from? Well, believe it or not, this manuscript is written on animal skin, known as parchment, oftentimes referred to as vellum. Vellum is a specific term referring to calf skin, whereas parchment is a catch-all term, meaning it could really be any type of animal skin. But that's what this is. This is real material, real vellum or parchment that was produced or made 700 years ago. It's one of the main reasons that this manuscript has survived for so long, for so many centuries, because it's extremely durable and strong material that they used to make it. But they would start with the skin selection. The parchment maker would select a young calf, sheep, or goat skins for these types of Bibles, often use exceptionally thin and well-preserved skins. As you can see on this manuscript, it is incredibly thin. It's so thin, if I were to get it at the right angle, you may not even be able to see it with how thin it is. Sometimes they're a little bit translucent even, but I have seen other manuscripts that are actually pretty thick in the vellum, like this Gregorian chant here to my right, but your left, is on very thick parchment. It's a very thick and durable skin, whereas these are much, much thinner. So you do see a wide variety of that over time, especially since they're handmade. The thickness will vary from leaf to leaf. But the skins were soaked in a lime solution to loosen the hair and the flesh. This is all the preparation that would go after, of course, they would slaughter the animal and then be able to take the skin, cut it up, and stretch it and loosen it up. So at this point, they're using the lime solution. The hair was then scraped away with what's called a lanellum, or a crescent-shaped knife. This knife, once they had the skin on the stretcher, they were able to take the knife and scrape off the looser hairs that were loosened because of that lime solution. And the wooden frame was called a hearse, where they would then stretch it out under tension, and that would make it real easy and smooth to just scrape off that hair. The result would then be thin parchment, like this manuscript right here. Very thin material, was stretched, and what's really interesting is a lot of times in some of these manuscripts you can see the little hair follicle dots throughout the manuscript, which is of course evidence of its history from antiquity. But when they're this thin, very rarely do you see the hair follicles. I have a thicker Hebrew scroll where the follicles are extremely clear and visible. However, this one here, just at a quick glance, I'm not seeing any obvious follicles left over on this, which would demonstrate the skill and quality of the parchment maker. So the surface was pumiced to create a slightly adhesive texture, and a dusting of chalk or powdered pumice improved ink adhesion. So a lot of preparation went into making this. When you're writing the ink on there, you want to ensure that the ink adheres to the material. If it's just kind of floating on top, it'll chip off very easily. You want it to, in a sense, stick in or bleed into the manuscript a little bit. But that is a major issue that you want to be concerned for or watch out for when handling these manuscripts, is because it is a thicker, almost flatter surface, you could accidentally chip off some of the ink because it is raised ever so slightly. But it does vary from manuscript to manuscript. This one, it seems as though it bled in pretty well, but you still want to be careful on the actual text block there to not wear it down or wipe it off, which is a really interesting feature, because when you have scribal errors, oftentimes they would scrape away. They didn't have erasers, especially since it's ink like that. So they would take a dull knife or a blade of some kind and scrape away their error that they made so they can then rewrite into the manuscript. Then, of course, you had the cutting of the page and the planning out of the manuscript. So large skins were cut into rectangular bifolia, so they wouldn't be just a single sheet like this. It would at least be two of these, so more of a rectangle, about one of these side to side. So these are two different Bibles here of every different sizes, but nevertheless similar. So it would be cut into a rectangular shape similar to this, which would be a bifolia or bifolium, and then they would have the larger rectangle here that could then be turned into 2 or technically 4 pages. So really fascinating and really interesting. I'll do another video on this one because this is a beautiful and fascinating piece, but I don't want to talk about it too much because I'll save that for another video. It's one of my prized possessions because of its really cool history and detail on there. But each sheet was then folded to create conjugate leaves. And Paris Bibles required strict standardization. Scribes followed layout conversion. So if you think about, if you ever went to college or even just high school, you would have requirements for how you were to write your papers. You have to either have double spaced and the indentations at certain points, and Times New Roman font, 12-point font as well, to make sure you get the right size and the right format, is very strict on that. And those same rules applied back in Paris when they were producing these Bibles. They had 2 columns of text, which you can see on this manuscript, very narrow margins, and a high line counts of around 48 lines per column, which is the classic typical amount, but it definitely varies from manuscript to manuscript. So you can actually tell a lot about a manuscript based on how many lines of text there are. So this one here is more of a standard Bible, but nonetheless a beautiful and rare Bible. Then you'd have the pricking and the ruling of the manuscript. Small holes were pricked along the edges using an awl. A hard point or lead plummet was used to draw ruling lines. So if you look carefully at the manuscript, you'll see what looks like a text block or almost like a notebook of these little tiny lines scored throughout the manuscript. This is what would help the scribe who's writing out the actual text have the individual lines and the right spacing for each of these because of those pre-ruled lines throughout the manuscript. That would show them how many lines of text they need and how to space them, and it was extremely helpful, but they would have special tools designed just to do that. Now the ink preparation, they would oftentimes use black ink. Sometimes you'd have brownish ink like you'd see in this Bowen Bible. I've done a video on that as well, so of course check that video out. But the black ink is iron gall ink made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. Red ink, or the rubrications, often vermilion or red lead. So these inks chemically bound with parchment, which is why writing survives over 700 years. These chemicals that they use were extremely effective in preserving the text on there. It's one of the reasons that someone like myself can own a manuscript like this, or now the new owner that I'll be going to can own something like this, because it was something that has been preserved for so long. We have so many copies still in circulation that people can use hundreds of years later. It's absolutely amazing and impressive to see that. The scribe who then would write the actual text on there. Now, what I will say, to take a quick break, the scribes sometimes would do all of these steps themselves, like a monastery might do the preparation of the paper all the way down to the binding of the book. But you have other times where maybe they'd source it out to different people and different illuminators who would do the artwork on here, like you see for this one here. So maybe one scribe or monk was committed to just doing the text, while another one was committed to doing the illumination. But you had some other scribes who did most of it. So it's varies from manuscript to manuscript. For this one, unfortunately, I have really no sure way, at least from my experience or understanding, of knowing who exactly would have produced this and how many hands were exactly involved in this single leaf here. But it still is an amazing thing to imagine and think about. But the scribe used a quill pen, frequently trimmed. The script type, of course, is Gothic textualis, bookhand, designed for compression, clarity, and uniformity. So this is a very common type of style text that you can see in these Bibles. I've seen it many times before. I've had dozens and dozens of these over the years, and this text is unmistakable. The Paris Bibles were written rapidly, but by highly trained professionals. But even though they did it quickly, it still took a year to 3 years to produce a single Bible. The text followed the standardized Vulgate order used in university settings. So this was more of a Bible that would have been used in a university or a college from that time period. The tight spacing and vertical strokes reflect the scholastic demand for portability. Now we get to the rubrication stage. After the main text was written out by the scribe, of course, all this done by hand and under dim light in a scriptorium, you'd have the text exemplar on the top, and then you'd have your manuscript below on the typical type of scribal desk, where you would then copy the text line by line, letter by letter, word for word, all the different punctuations, everything that went into it was matched as perfectly as possible. Oftentimes you'd have scribes struggling from what's called parablexis, where they would accidentally repeat the same word twice or the same sentence twice because they're just going back and forth, back and forth. It's very easy to make those types of mistakes. So you'd have scratch outs or different areas like that. I did see a comment on one of my other videos where someone was saying how if they made a mistake, they would throw away the entire Bible. That's not entirely true. If they made a mistake, they of course would correct it. But to Basically, let's say you were writing out this whole manuscript and you got to this very last line and you accidentally repeated the previous line, or you wrote the wrong word. A scribe wouldn't discard of this whole piece of paper. Think about all the steps we've talked to up to this point. Getting rid of this whole parchment piece and just tossing it to the side would be extremely wasteful, waste of time and money and resources that were scarce during this time period. So you would, rather than discarding the whole thing, would just simply scratch it out and fill it in with a correction on the side. I've seen many manuscripts like that. I have one that has a scribal correction on it, and then another one that I had previously that had a very clear and pretty interesting scribal correction. So it's not something that would be discarded, but something that would be taken seriously. But the rubricator added chapter headings, running titles, and red paragraph marks. And then they would also fill in blank spaces left by the scribe to fill in. So again, using this manuscript as a reference, you've got the heading there, you've got the red portion here, you've got where the initial is, where they would have a blank space of text, so the rubricator could then go in there and fill in their different initials. This manuscript indicates that it was done by a professional. I mean, this is so impressive and so detailed and so beautiful that a professional would likely need to do this. The process was the initial sketched lightly, so they would then kind of sketch something in there to be their template that they would then paint in. Sometimes if they use gold, they would apply the gold first using gesso or mordant base. Gold was then burnished to shine. The colored pigments added was azurite for the blue, organic pink lakes, lead white highlights, and the penwork flourished added in red and blue. So these inks, you can talk a lot more about how those were produced, and maybe I'll do that in a future video, and maybe even try and make some of my own ink using medieval recipes. I think that'd be really interesting and fun, but interesting and amazing nonetheless. You can see a long initial here with the blue initial, and then the rubricated red portion, or the initial, going down almost the entire text block in this beautiful red ink there. Illuminators often worked separately from the scribe. So as I mentioned earlier, some scribes might do both of it, but more often than not, you'd have the scribe write out the actual text, and then the illuminator would come in after the fact and do the beautiful artwork on these Bibles. So very typical to book bindings. You had this collection of different quires, which would then be sewn together and then attached into an actual binding with the boards and the leather and all of that. And then you would essentially have this small Paris Bible that would be complete and ready for use. It's absolutely fascinating. The intended use was not a luxury display Bible. It was typically a scholarly tool used by university masters, theology students, or Dominicans or Franciscan preaching, or scholars writing commentaries. So a Bible like this would have been used by someone like that, or in that profession, being able to reference this Bible like we were to read our own Bibles today. Absolutely amazing. This is a great piece of history, and I've talked for quite some time at this point, so I don't want to stretch this out any further. But there's a lot of history that can be discussed regarding this manuscript, but we'll end it there for sake of time. I appreciate you sticking it out to the full video. I know this was a bit more technical, as I mentioned at the beginning, but fascinating nonetheless. So you'll want to stick it out to the complete end, because I show this manuscript in a lot more detail with just some nice music. You can enjoy all the beauty and kind of take in all the different elements that were discussed in this video. If you find this content interesting, of course, subscribe to the channel. Check out my other long-form videos. I cover a wide range of Bible history and topics just like this one, and some different aspects or elements of them. So, of course, check those out. I appreciate you guys watching it to the end, and comment your thoughts. I'd love to see what you think about this manuscript, or if you want to see any other discussions or aspects of these medieval manuscripts discussed, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Of course, comment below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.